Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man exploring the strange and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, HJDoom, and this is another episode in our increasingly long-running series looking at the films of the Asylum, the mockbuster-focused studio often considered the worst film production company in the world. This time out we're looking at Ape Vs Monster from 2021, a mockbuster of Godzilla Vs Kong, itself essentially a remake of King Kong vs Godzilla from 1962, the third Godzilla movie of the original run. This podcast is brought to you by the generous support of my patrons over at patreon.com/HJDoom. Without their support, I wouldn't be able to justify spending my finite time on this earth watching some of the lowest budget films ever made and talking about them for longer than they deserve. Aside from the warm glow of keeping the show on the air, patrons also receive a bunch of gamebooks written by members of the Doom household, and there's another one due out very soon indeed. I've just got to finish writing it. My thanks as always to everyone who is kind enough to support my nonsense. That I'm a big fan of Godzilla movies is probably among the least surprising things you could learn about me. The only thing less surprising than learning I'm a big Godzilla fan would be learning that I found a way to be a tiresome hipster Luddite about it. It probably won't be a massive shock if I tell you that I have some fairly strong views about which Godzilla films are worth my time, and these are almost entirely focused on the so-called Showa era of the films, those made when the Emperor of Japan was named Showa. This run of 15 films from 1954's seminal Godzilla through to 1975's Terror of Mechagodzilla are the ultimate canon of Godzilla movies as far as I'm concerned. I did enjoy some of the later Heisei-era films, and I very much enjoyed the recent Godzilla -1, but there's something about those initial 15 films that later kaiju movies have failed to capture for me. Part of it is the special effects. 1975 is perhaps almost the last point that a man dressed in a bulky dinosaur costume kicking down cardboard office buildings could be seen as in any way current-era special effects. As the 80s and 90s arrived, the old-school methods of bringing giant monster carnage to the screen began to seem more and more out of place compared to the special effects revolution that was occurring with the advent of workable computer-generated images. To me, Godzilla belongs to the past. It may have begun in the 1950s with a harrowing explosion of nuclear trauma and environmental paranoia, but Godzilla rapidly became something else, and it's those brightly coloured 1960s movies that feel to me the definitive version of the character. I love all the hokey science fiction nonsense that creeps in, with a slew of aliens being behind the various giant monster attacks over the period. The series arguably peaks with 1968's Destroy All Monsters, which features a whole host of monsters from the previous Godzilla movies and beyond, dragging in various other kaiju properties in a boisterously stupid and over-the-top orgy of rubber-suited carnage. Charles Manson may have killed the 60s in the US, but I would argue that the execrable 1969 Godzilla movie All Monsters Attack, which followed Destroy All Monsters, was at least as responsible worldwide. I have rather less time for American iterations of the character. Not only did the 1998 attempt to create a US remake fundamentally redesign the character in a way that obliterated all traces of the original's appearance, for reasons that I assume were heavily cocaine-related, the soundtrack also featured Jamiroquai, which means that the film was both unwatchable and unlistenable at the same time. Even before I'd watched Ape Vs Monster, I was certain that it was going to be better than Godzilla 98. I didn't mind the Gareth Edwards remake of Godzilla from 2014. It showed a degree of reverence for the character and seemed like a sincere effort to portray Godzilla in a way that utilised modern technology, while remaining faithful to something of the spirit of the original movies. However, there's always seemed to me a refusal to fully embrace how gloriously stupid those classic Godzilla films are. While I accept that in terms of pure quality, the original Godzilla is the best actual film in the franchise, I think that more modern iterations need to lean less on that and more on just how kitsch and silly the films became over the years. Not everything needs to be shot in slow motion with portentous bass noises farting all over it. Personally, I blame The Dark Knight for a lot of this. Now, I did also see the King Kong remake headed by Peter Jackson, which I thought was basically fine, but not a patch on the original. I might have seen Skull Island, but if I did, it was in a drunken stupor, which may well be the ideal way to view that particular movie. I haven't seen any of the American Monsterverse movies that followed 2014's Godzilla, though I have promised on my heart that I will go to the cinema the moment they remake Ibira Horror of the Deep and include the giant lobster tennis scene. As with all these things, I don't especially begrudge these films existing so long as people enjoy them. I do wish there was a more distinctively American kaiju movie series though, perhaps a monster made out of irradiated guns and type 2 diabetes. Honestly, there should be a kaiju for every country. I humbly submit that the British one should be a massive racist pensioner, and the government's proposed solution to the rampage should be giving it everything it wants. Then the giant pensioner smashes the Greggs factory and the whole country rises up to beat it to death with their umbrellas. I am available for script work. I hope that's clarified my stance on kaiju movies. I'm a big fan, but I'm also a dick about it and recoil from anything that smacks of modernity, which to be honest is what they're going to be carving into my gravestone. When we consider this mockbuster of Godzilla vs Kong, it's important to remember that my reference point is actually the 1963 movie in which the titular giant ape is a full-on man in a hairy suit, wearing a mask that was designed by someone who had definitely seen at least one gorilla in their life, but probably quite a few years ago, and felt that looking up reference photographs would be cheating. Looking up reference material also seems to have been something the stuntman inside the gorilla suit regarded as cheating, since he's making very little effort to move in any kind of authentic simian fashion. All you need to know about 1963's King Kong vs Godzilla is that there's a scene where Kong is flown onto Mount Fuji hanging from what looks like a set of party balloons, and that's very much the energy I'm looking for with this movie. And it is, to a certain extent, the energy that Ape Vs Monster brings to the table. For all that it's trying to ride on the coattails of a modern riff on battling monsters, it's actually got more of the elements of an old-school kaiju movie from the 1960s. Ape Vs Monster was directed by Daniel Lusko, yet another of those ham and eggers that haunt the margins of mainstream Hollywood that the Asylum seems to have on speed dial. He's got 21 directing credits on his IMDb page, and if you've heard of any of them, then there's something profoundly wrong with you. He's done a few Asylum movies, and a few movies that look a lot like Asylum movies, but when I checked, they were actually made by a different, equally morally bankrupt production company. The token name you might have heard of on this cast list is Eric Roberts. He's Julia Roberts' much less famous brother, but what he lacks in star power, he makes up for in ubiquity. Eric Roberts is not an actor who turns down projects, and I'm honestly amazed that we haven't seen him in an Asylum movie before now. He has 886 acting credits on IMDb at the time that I wrote this script. I'll say that again, 886 acting credits on IMDb, which makes him the most prolific actor in Hollywood history, and not far behind the most prolific actor in history altogether, Brahman Andam, who has over 1,100 acting credits to his name in Bollywood. Eric Roberts seems to be equally happy doing a supporting turn in The Dark Knight or The Expendables, or doing a supporting turn in Wrongful Death 2 Bloodlines. He's an absolute machine, and it's nice that the Asylum have finally given him a chance to showcase his ability to sit down and talk on the phone, as that's very much what he'll be doing for the course of this film. The film is more properly led by Ariana Renee and Katie Sareka, who are doing much of the heavy lifting in the acting department. The rest of the cast is made up of the usual mix of underwhelming character actors and people without a headshot on IMDb or a Wikipedia page to call their own. Let's examine the plot. Renee and Sareka play a pair of scientists, one American and the other Russian, who have links to a mysterious project that was somehow a joint US and Russian space mission. I don't know if you remember the space race between the Soviet Union and the Americans, but one of the really big things about it was they didn't really collaborate all that much. One of the key features of this film is that the Russians and the US are still somehow cooperating on stuff in 2021, something other than the systematic dismantling of the US democratic process, that is. The thing they collaborated on in 2007 that is important for this film is shooting a chimp into space in the hope of contacting alien life. At no point is it clear that they were shooting it in any particular direction, or that they knew where there was some alien life. They seem to have just bunged a chimp into a capsule and yeeted it into space and gone, hopefully he runs into some aliens. Now, I don't know if you've ever watched a nature documentary about chimps or looked into their behaviour, but if you were looking for a way to make peaceful contact with another species, you'd probably file sending chimps somewhere around the same level as sending bombs. They are not gentle creatures. They are shockingly violent and aggressive creatures with a noted taste for meat. Multiple ape researchers have been viciously attacked by angry chimps over the years. They are not a species that you want to mess with, and certainly not a species I'd trust to make a positive first impression on anyone. If you can find a chimp in a small box and posted it to me, I don't think my first thought on opening the package would be, they come in peace. Nonetheless, that's what the secret operation did in 2007. Now, in 2021, the capsule thought lost with a chimp inside is on its way back to Earth. It lands in the middle of nowhere, and a large and predictably angry chimp smashes his way out. And it's actually quite nicely shot, a mid-range shot of the capsule, shaking with each attack from within, and it has a degree of quiet menace to it. We are introduced to several things at the same time. Eric Roberts is somehow in charge, even though I don't know what his job is supposed to be. Ariana Renee works for NASA in some capacity, and she has to work with a huge man with a huge beard from Homeland Security for reasons that are unclear. Also, they will nakedly use the exact same stock footage clip of Langley and the Pentagon every time they go to a scene there. Renee and the man with a massive beard head off to the desert to investigate the crash. This means externals, always a treat, and there's actually going to be quite a few in this movie. There's a lovely scene with the bearded man and his team going in, peering down the barrels of their guns, including one guy doing that with a bazooka like he's going to quick-fire heavy explosives at the first squirrel he sees. It's very stupid. I love it. On arrival at the capsule, it becomes clear that something has broken out from the inside, and also everything is covered in green goo. Green goo could be important. Renee tells the bearded man not to touch anything and goes back to their vehicle. Somehow, despite everyone staring down the barrels of their guns on the way back to the vehicle, an ape the size of a tree manages to ambush them in the broadly featureless desert. Creatures of prodigious size successfully sneaking up on people will be something of a recurring feature of this film. The giant ape murders quite a lot of people, and Renee tries to intervene but only succeeds in falling over and knocking herself out. It is at this point a mysterious woman shows up and shoots the giant ape with a tranquilizer gun. Everything fades to black. It's at this point we should maybe talk about the special effects in this film and the CGI for the two monsters in particular. It's kind of fascinating to me. The last time we saw a giant ape, it was in 2005's King of the Lost World, and that ape looked absolutely atrocious, somehow even less like an actual ape than a man in a suit. This ape actually looks like an ape and moves with something approximating a simian gait. I was pleasantly surprised. It's still broadly at the level of TV effects about a decade before this was made, but not terrible TV effects. They've clearly spent some time trying to get the look of the monsters not right exactly, but less wrong than usual. Maybe I'm slightly biased at the moment because on Sunday I watched a 50s movie where the giant alien monster was a badly superimposed and obviously dead lobster that had been fashioned into a crude puppet, and maybe that's slightly warped what I consider to be an acceptable level of special effects. The ape looks pretty good. The other giant monster will also look pretty good when we get to it, albeit that mostly means it looks like the member of the Godzilla family the rest don't like to talk about. What the monsters are not is on screen very often, and I guess that's the compromise you have to make at this budget level. You can have fairly good monsters, but you can't actually use them very much because you've only paid for so much of the digital effects team's time. Given the obvious constraints though, I think the way the monsters are used is quite clever. They've been used on screen at points where you definitely need to see the monster for the scene to make sense. When you don't need to see the full monster, you'll get a quick shot of a leg or a swinging ape fist, and when they can get away with just showing reactions or doing something else, they'll do that. What this means is that you don't ever actually get scenes that flat out don't work. There's always just enough actual monster to sell what's going on, but not a second more. And this goes a long way towards making the movie feel closer to an actual movie than is often the case. And yeah, I think there's been a really interesting degree of thought shown going, we absolutely have to have a monster on screen here. What's the smallest number of shots we can do that in? And we can get away with not having the monster on screen here. Let's do that instead. I mean, it's not all good by any means, and any praise of Asylum CGI is always going to be like praising a less than usually offensive fart. And it's common for films at all budgets to struggle with consistently sizing their CGI creations from shot to shot, and that's doubly the case with a low-budget film where you simply don't have the time to lay out shots based on the maths of how far away you need to be to ensure that the monster is going to look the same size when the visual effects are added. In Ape Vs Monster, the monsters, especially the ape, change size from shot to shot. Sometimes the ape towers over the action, and sometimes he seems about the size of someone you might nickname Big Jim. Such is the curse of the Asylum. Even when they seem to be trying quite hard, there's always something truly broken. It reminds you why the Asylum likes doing CGI things that can fly so much. It's just much harder to work out what size things are supposed to be when they're hovering and not on the ground. They could just be further away or closer. You can't tell because they don't have any feet. Back in the action, the ape has been tranquilized and the mysterious woman is revealed as Katie Sareka, a Russian scientist and old friend of Renee. They have a slightly complicated friendship, not least because Sareka's bosses in Russia are duplicitous types who have their own agenda which they're trying to get Sareka to follow. It's extremely unclear how Sareka got to the US, where she sits in the chain of command, why the entire lab they've set up to study the giant ape is staffed exclusively by Russians. There's genuinely a nice dynamic between the two lead characters though, as Renee's unwavering moral stance is contrasted with Sareka's bruised pragmatism, and I like that. Once everyone is back at the lab, we get to see a Gila monster just cheerfully lapping up some green goo from the capsule so that it can grow to enormous size as well, leaving a large puddle of alien green goo that turns things into monsters at the scene that you literally just tried to secure is definitely an oversight from the perspective of hazard containment, especially as it's clearly absolutely delicious. We get a bit of business in the lab where the newly captured ape nearly escapes so that soldiers can threaten to shoot him, and Renee can be more compassionate towards him. Sareka has a little chat with her weirdly communist-seeming superiors in Moscow who refer to her as comrade for unclear reasons. Then we're back to the important business at hand, giant monsters with elite infiltration skills. A soldier has been appointed to keep an eye on the capsule and decides that he's gonna check it out, which means getting inside it and then hearing a big roar that sounds like Godzilla if Godzilla smoked 80 Marlboro a day. This spooks him and he decides to get out of there. Sadly, he's too slow because a giant Gila monster pops up unexpectedly and eats him. At this point, I really should make absolutely clear that once it starts growing, the giant Gila monster no longer resembles in any way, shape or form a Gila monster. It's just an off-brand Godzilla, unlike the ape, which does more or less resemble a massive chimpanzee at all times. Renee and her metrosexual sidekick, lab assistant, go to the capsule site and find half of the soldier that the Gila monster didn't feel like eating. Meanwhile, Eric Roberts finds time to deliver a monologue about how much he doesn't trust the Russians, and it gets weirdly racist. Between racism and people investigating the crash site again, Sareka has been left to her own devices. Her research indicates that the green goo is dying. It cannot survive in Earth's atmosphere, but it can live for much longer inside a host. She hits on the bright idea of injecting all their remaining samples into the ape to preserve them. Surely this is a plan with absolutely no drawbacks. We now approach my favourite set piece of the movie. Renee and her sidekick are following the trail of the Gila monster and they find a railway bridge that's been knocked down. There's a train coming! It's going to fall off the bridge! Except it doesn't fall off the bridge because the Gila monster suddenly pops up from nowhere grabs the train and yeets the train at Renee's car, narrowly missing it. Seeing a large lizard throw a train is just delightful on many, many levels, but my favourite bit is that neither Renee nor her sidekick, nor the soldier they have with them, make any reference to this having happened once it's finished. They get out of the car and she just says, "Looks like we're going to have to walk from here," as though the car had run out of petrol rather than narrowly avoiding a lizard-chucked train. It's completely batshit insane. I can only assume that they didn't really know what visual effects they were going to put in at that point. There was just going to be something happening, so the script just didn't know what was going to happen, so they couldn't talk about it or say, "Oh no, those poor people in that train," for example, or "Wow, we just escaped being crushed by a train chucked by a giant Gila monster. That doesn't happen every day." Once Sareka has injected the ape with more alien goo, she's able to go on a rescue mission in the heavily armed helicopter that the US government seems entirely cool with the scientist having. At this point, the walkers have run into the Gila monster again, and she tries shooting it with missiles, and then with a chain gun, and then the Gila monster responds by eating a black guy who was being kept around for literally this exact reason and nothing else. The Gila monster then runs off by burrowing underground at tremendous speed, so it's back to the base, where the ape has apparently grown even more massive and broken out. Who could have foreseen such a thing occurring? With the ape and the Gila monster loose in the world, we're essentially spinning our wheels for a little bit, trying to come up with a plan to deal with the problem, interspersed with occasional monster attacks. Turns out Renee's dad was very involved in the programme to launch chimps at random at theoretical aliens. Also, it turns out he's a prick. The cast spitball ideas for capturing the ape, and a very angry general repeatedly suggests bombs would be the best solution. Constantly angry, psychotic generals is one of my favourite stock B-movie characters, and bit part actor RJ Wagner is giving it his absolute all. I've rarely seen such a consistently furious man in my life, and I used to work in retail. What we're building towards is the big reveal that the ape and the Gila monster are slowly converging on Washington DC because they're being controlled by beams being sent by an alien spacecraft. And this is exactly the sort of classic kaiju nonsense I was hoping for. The only man who can help in this situation, it turns out, is Renee's dad, who rocks up in his wheelchair like a laconic American Dr. Strangelove and tries to suggest that leaving Renee's mother was the only logical call. Selfish intellectual who reckons he can logically justify the things he was going to do anyway is not one of my favourite stock characters, not least because of how widely they're represented on the internet. Science Dad has a plan to put a transmitter on the Washington Monument that will disrupt the alien control beams. Hopefully that means the monsters will fight each other. There's just time for Renee to work out that Sareka stuffed the ape full of alien giant juice and have a massive falling out with her before we head to DC for the finale. And the finale is odd. This is where the film really starts to struggle to reconcile what the script wants with what the visual effects budget can stand. So far, we've mostly seen the monsters in the middle of nowhere, but now they need to interact with a city, and it goes without saying that they are definitely not actually filming in DC. So the monsters need to interact with stock footage of Washington DC and the usual bits of downtown LA that the Asylum believes, erroneously, can stand in for literally any city anywhere in the world. A lot of the monster rampage seems to be happening a very long way away from the vantage point of the characters. Distant half-seen shadows and CGI explosions suggesting that something very exciting might be happening to people all the way over there. The ape does climb the Washington Monument during the chaos, which is a nice riff on the King Kong finale. The general orders his men to fire rockets at the Washington Monument, which doesn't kill the ape, but does break the monument itself, which ironically falls directly onto the general, killing him dead. One of the many unanswered questions in this film is why the general was standing close enough to the monument to be crushed by the top falling off, but nothing in this film is ever remotely clear. The General's ill-conceived rocket attack has the unfortunate side effect of destroying the transmitter, meaning that the two monsters are able to rampage at will according to the aliens' baffling plan to do a fair amount of damage to the nation's capital through the medium of large animals. Things get so serious that Eric Roberts stands up. Science Dad and Rene reconcile when he sort of admits he shouldn't have made a career out of torturing animals in space, and Rene duly heads to a multi-storey car park where a spare prototype transmitter is unaccountably sitting in a van. She gets it working, and we do see a fight between the ape and the Gila monster. The Gila monster seems to be winning, but Soraka shows up with her helicopter to apologise to Rene and then crash her helicopter into the Gila monster, distracting it for long enough that the ape can beat it to death, in a scene I would describe as vaguely representing the thing that's supposed to be actually happening on screen. We get a short coda in which it is revealed that the ape is being sent to a remote island to live out its massive life in peace, with Rene and the lead scientist looking after him, and there's a shot of the ape standing next to a massive American flag for some reason. The aliens have scarpered, their plans are in ruins thanks to an extremely aggressive and large primate, and that's the end. Is Ape Vs Monster a good film? No, it really isn't. Did I enjoy it? Yes, I really did. It's a film that generates a fair amount of goodwill by being willing to try and actually cash the checks that the script is writing. It's not always able to do that, but it feels like there was an honest attempt to try and get something watchable on the screen rather than endlessly fobbing the audience off with just nonsense. There's obviously not enough of either the ape or the Gila monster, but they're actually more present in the story than I was expecting, and I genuinely enjoyed the sudden appearance of a flying saucer to add to the already high ambient levels of nonsense. The actors are all giving it their best, as they generally do. They're not especially good as such, but I'll take awkward and hammy over awkward and muted any day of the week, and the two leads acquit themselves pretty well. I think most of all I liked how it held together as a narrative despite making no sense whatsoever at any juncture. The core tension between the Russian scientist and her old friend Rene is very watchable, but at the same time the film never makes any coherent case for why this bizarre situation happened and why it is being allowed to persist. The science is beyond ridiculous in a way that you almost never get these days. It shows the kind of levels of scientific illiteracy that you can only have by engaging in a dogmatic refusal to Google even a single element of your script to check for plausibility. It reminds me so much of those 1950s and 60s B-movies that came from an age before research was really a thing that scriptwriters were expected to do, and honestly, I love that. Then there's everyone being constantly surprised by monsters the size of a building, which is hard to swallow in Washington DC, but even more insane for the large portions of the film that are shot in the desert. All in all, Ape Vs Monster delivers that rare thing, a film I can honestly say is so bad it's good. It's such a fine line between the fun kind of incompetence and the aggravating kind of incompetence, but by delivering something that really does have the feel of the more demented end of classic kaiju cinema, this lands extremely well for me. I think the key elements are big characters and just enough actual effects work to keep things exciting. It's a great one for Asylum connoisseurs as well, because it is constantly skating along that familiar catastrophe curve whereby the film is in danger of collapsing into something unwatchable at any given moment, but never quite does. I had a remarkably good time with it, considering, and I definitely enjoyed it much more than the 90s Hollywood version of Godzilla, which is hardly surprising. That film is an abomination. It's got a charm to it. That's a woolly concept to end on, but it is what I fundamentally took away. There's an earnestness and a determination to sell the nonsense as well as they possibly can for the money, which I really appreciate. I think the worst Asylum films are often the ones that feel as cynical in execution as they were in conception, and the best ones are often those that are simply trying their hardest. Ape vs Monster is trying really quite hard, and I sort of loved it. That's all for this episode. I think the next episode will have to be a patron's choice. There'll be a poll up on Patreon so they can choose my doom. I think we might be looking at choosing between sequels to films we've already covered, so I'm sure that will be nice. If you want to get in touch with me in the meantime, you can do so by emailing me at HJDoomRetroFun, all one word, at gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky. If you'd like to leave a rating or a review, that would be super sweet of you. Thank you very much for listening, take care, and I'll see you soon.